Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 36th episode of It's Your Time Now, a program dedicated to promoting the ongoing struggle for true constitutional reform by providing the public with the information needed for constructive and honest participation in a free and fair forum. As we have been discussing over the past months, the Constitution, that is the highest law of the land that effectively controls the exercise of power, can best be understood by considering the role and functions of the Parliament and the Executive in relation to each other. This week, we will be examining the role and function of the Senate in passing laws and holding the government of the day accountable to the citizenry. As we have discussed previously, the Parliament consists of two houses or chambers: the Senate, also known as the upper house, and the House of Representatives, the lower house. So far, much of our focus and discussion has been concentrated on the House of Representatives, where the members are fully elected by the people under the first-past-the-post electoral system, which, after careful analysis, we discovered does not always create a parliament that is representative, responsible, and accountable. Under the first-past-the-post electoral system, each voter votes for one of the candidates in the voter's constituency, and the candidate with the most votes is then elected to represent the people of that constituency in the House of Representatives. So what about the Senate? What is its composition and function? And what role does it have to play, if any, in holding the government of the day accountable to the citizenry? Section 40 of the Constitution, which deals with the Senate, stipulates that the Senate shall have 31 members, all of which are nominated, not elected, as in the House of Representatives. 16 government senators appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister, 6 opposition senators appointed on the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, and 9 independent senators appointed by the President to represent other sectors of civil society. The presiding officer, the President of the Senate, is usually elected from the government benches. Therefore, like the House of Representatives, the majority of the senators in the Senate not only form part of the government, but are also members of the cabinet, such as the Attorney General, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Trade and Industry, the Minister of the Environment and Water Resources, etc. And so similarly, what we see happening in the Senate is members of the government again controlling the Parliament, whose activities is supposed to be monitored on behalf of the people. But yet again, because of the deficiencies in our current Constitution, we find ourselves at the mercy again of the government of the day. Further, as we have seen happening time and time again in the Senate, even if the 6 opposition senators and the 9 independent senators were to vote against the government legislation they believe not to be in the best interests of the country, their combined votes of 6 plus 9 would be 15 and still not enough to outnumber the 16 government senators if they all voted in favor of their ruling party. But even more worrying is the fact that if for some reason the Senate failed to pass a bill after 2 successive sessions, it will nonetheless still become law. And so in effect, the Senate too can be described as nothing more than a talking shop that ultimately ends with the government of the day doing as it so pleases, with nothing and no one to hold it account for its actions, even when it may not be in the best interest of the people. So how then, if the government of the day controls both the Senate and the House of Representatives, that is, the Parliament, does the Constitution aim to ensure accountability? And do these safeguards actually work? It has been said, whether it's business or government, we are talking about accountability is essential because it enforces standards of responsible leadership, And responsible leadership creates public trust, and public trust is crucial to any government that wants to survive and flourish. All too often, governments forget that citizens are the shareholders in their government and have a stake in holding their elected officials accountable for the way they govern. Continuing public confidence in our institutions will depend on the assurance that the public is indeed getting value for the money that they, taxpayers, are providing, and that the power is not abused. If governments are to be truly responsible, legislation must hold them accountable for their management of the public purse. So how exactly does the Constitution, coupled with legislation, that is, other laws, try to achieve this? Well, the process of holding the government accountable for the management of the public purse begins with the presentation to the Parliament of a document known as the Annual Estimates of Revenue and Expenditure, which contains in detail the amounts expected to be raised as revenue and the amounts expected to be spent on all government activities from the revenue raised. In layman terms, it is a document that lists how much money you expect to raise and how much money you expect to spend. Then, secondly, this is then followed by the presentation of the budget by the Minister of Finance. This presentation is known as the budget speech and outlines the government's general financial plans for the following fiscal year. Following the budget debate in the Parliament, the Minister of Finance then releases funds to the ministries and departments which are to be spent. So far, so good. 4 months after the end of each financial year, that is on the 31st of January, the law then requires the Treasury to submit Treasury statements, each accounting officer to submit an appropriation account, that is, the account of all governmental agencies that receive a credit, each receiver of revenue to submit a statement of receipts and disbursements, and each administering officer to submit statements of the funds administered. In other words, all money spent must be accounted for with evidence. After that happens, the Auditor General is then required to examine those statements, accounts, receipts, disbursements, and report to the Parliament after such examination within 7 months at the end of the financial year. That is, on or before April 30th. The report of the Auditor General, after being presented to the Parliament, is then referred to the Public Accounts Committee for scrutiny, which then reports to Parliament on its examinations and recommendations. This, in a nutshell, is the accountability process of keeping track of how our hard-earned taxpayers' money are spent. But how effective is this process in reality, and does it work? Well, in the words of the Auditor General, Ms. Sharon Otley, in her 2013 report, and I quote, she says, "The state of internal audit functions in the ministries and departments remains a matter of great concern, as in prior years. The examination of records and documents show that in many instances, there was non-compliance with financial instructions, financial regulations, and other financial directives, while reports on appropriation accounts did not match what was produced for examination during the audit." And she continued, "There were numerous instances where documents were requested for audit purposes and were not produced. This represents a serious breach of both the Auditor General's constitutional and legal right to access all documents relating to the public accounts and of financial and accountability requirements." Close quote. So in effect, ladies and gentlemen, we begin where we started. It is impossible to expect the Parliament to hold the same government that controls it to account. It just simply cannot work. To discuss this issue of accountability further and the role of the Senate in holding the government of the day accountable to the people, we have with us a former A-level and CAPE teacher of sociology and Caribbean studies for over 8 years, a part-time lecturer at the University of the West Indies School and Continuing Studies, and sorry, forgive me, the School of Continuing Studies and COSTAT, an opposition senator from 2008 to 2010, the former Senate Vice President from 2010 to 2013, a former deputy political leader of the United National Congress and the ILP, and the current political leader of the ILP, Mrs. Lyndira Oudit. Welcome, Mrs. Oudit.
It's a pleasure, Mickela.
Thank you so much for... Is it okay if I call you Lyndira? I do it. Lovely. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you. I know you have an extremely busy schedule and you've taken the time out, and me personally and the viewers appreciate it deeply. Let me first say congratulations on your new position as political leader of the ILP.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
If we could begin our discussion with the Senate, for which you were the Vice President for 3 years, in the context of constitutional reform, do you think the Senate, not only whilst you were there, but I know in your experience, do you think the Senate is able to and or has held the government of the day to account, not necessarily just the People's Partnership, but when the PNM were in power?
Mickela, sadly, our constitution, as your father would rightly say, is flawed. And having a flawed constitution in terms of the way in which Parliament operates, the criteria used to get into Parliament, and I think the country must always be reminded, Parliament does not get persons from those who apply for a job. Parliament gets persons who come through the party structures. And so if you go further back from when they become a member of Parliament, you have to step back. How does a person become a member of Parliament in the first place? It is at the party level. And parties, and the way in which, therefore, the parties are allowed to operate, the way in which an election is allowed to bring forth successful individuals who then assume roles in the Parliament. The Parliament can only be successful if you look at all of the stages leading up to then identify...
To who the ultimate members
correct.
Are.
But in terms of the Senate and the lower house, because of the 29, because of the majority in the lower house, most times bills are passed because of the majority. Again, coming right back to the constitution that we have, first past the post. When it comes to the Senate, you really have 15, 6, and 9, as you rightly said. And the president has not had a track record of voting. It is never really the precedent where a president, and I have presided at for several lengths of time. In fact, 2 budgets, the first budget of the government I presided, as well as the second budget. So the Senate really does not have where the president has a casting vote. We've never had that experience. But even if you come, you can have a hung Senate. What happens is that there are conditions for giving support after committee stage. And one of the things I must say at this point is far more work takes place at the Senate level because there's far more scrutiny at the committee stage. And you find that in the lower house, bills come 15, 20 minutes, they finish, 1, 2 speakers, and that's it. The Senate now, because it is seen and sees itself as having far more oversight and powers of scrutiny, you would find that the committee stage of bills is where a lot of things change.
Okay, so let us say that with the right intention to scrutinize a particular bill, every member of the Senate, whether it's a member of the government, a member of the opposition, one of the independents, give it their all and everything comes, and questions are answered and debate goes back and forth. Ultimately, it must go back to the House of Representatives. And if you don't agree and you send it back, and they send it back again to you. Yes. And like I said, in 2 successive sessions, you still cannot pass that bill. It'll be passed anyway. Yeah. So is it that all your work, not because of the individuals, but the defect in the Constitution that really nullifies the work of the Senate, if we can so say, negates the work of the Senate, because ultimately it's the House of Representatives, the lower house, that's going to decide whether a bill is passed or not.
The irony of that, and I fully agree with you, and the irony of that is very clear when it comes to the parties in the lower house and the representatives in the upper house. Very often, there is even during the debate a very different angle that is taken. Now at the end, how the members of the parties vote in the lower house. Ultimately, you have to toe the party line. So in the Senate, even though there might be far wider debate, more points, a lot of new discussions that take place when a bill is brought in the Senate, at the end of the day, they toe the line. And we have seen time and time again, you just have to vote according to how the House of Representatives. So it does color and change everything in the Senate, because there is no true sense of I'm able to say this and I'm able to vote accordingly after.
And if they choose not to listen, well, they choose not to listen, which takes us on to our other point. Is there therefore need for a Senate at all? And before you go on to that, I don't know if you've had the opportunity, you may not have, so please don't worry if you haven't. The proposals that the Ramadan Commission on Constitutional, they propose, and I must read this out for the public who may not have had an opportunity. The People's Partnership has proposed, we have, speaking for them, a Senate with equal powers and numbers. So that's equal powers, so that's as 41. A House, that's as 41 and equal plus. Powers, okay? So that's 41, okay, plus. With the House of Representatives that is elected on first past the post, no change there. And the Senate will have 9 members nominated by the President, still no change there. And the rest of the 32 members in the Senate elected by using a PR system, which is an extremely complicated system. I have to tell you, I did not grasp the whole thing myself. I really did not know what their intention was. But what are your views on that? Do we need a Senate at all, 1? And 2, what are your views on what the Ramadan Constitutional Reform Commission has suggested, which I'm not sure that anybody
has any idea,
really understands themselves?
Sure.
What are your views on that?
With respect to the first question, whether there is need for a Senate, there is definitely a need for the Senate, because if you're left with just the House of Representatives, you have elected members who very often do not do justice for bringing to bear in the public domain all the ramifications of legislation that comes towards or to the lower house. We generally do not have. In fact, you have more politicking in the lower house. For example, if you look at the debate on the procurement, and you would look, and I was so disappointed. I was looking at the debate, and I must say that some members of the government, I was so disappointed in what the comments were. It's as if nobody had even read the bill. And you know, these are serious things. So with respect to the Senate being necessary, yes, absolutely. In fact, it is even more necessary in my mind, especially the way in which we have been allowing our parliaments to run for the last few decades. Sure. With respect to the proposal in the Prakash Ramadan Commission report, which by itself is highly irresponsible, in that proportional representation is not a new notion. When you think back to 1974 and the Wooding Commission,
yes,
you come straight up, and there have been several and successive reports for constitutional reform.
Yes.
what Mr. Ramada did, Minister Ramada, what he did was he actually took consultations that were done under the last administration. He looked at them, he continued a series, maybe a few of the consultations again. So he had other consultations, but he took the documents from the last administration, brought it out, put it together and said, okay, let's consult. His report does not have any solutions. It does not have any proposals.
It complicates the issue even more.
It complicates it. Plus, there are so many issues. You now have to take this. It has been accepted by the cabinet, but the decision is that it has to go back for consultation. Now, when it comes to the Senate, it's a very interesting proposal. You would recall in local government last year, the notion of PR, proportional representation, came in the selection of aldermen.
Aldermen, right.
Somewhere along the line, it seems as if somebody got up one morning and had a nice idea that we're going to start and introduce PR. No big thought about how we are going to do this. What you talk about the understanding.
Or that there are about 100 versions of PR.
Correct. Now, there's different formulas. The formula for PR, we have the local government election, we have a general election. We have what is called a single transferable vote.
Yes.
And then you have a party list vote. How did the current government come up with a method? Now, I think it's important for people to understand that there are 35 healthy, very balanced, progressive democracies in the world that currently have their elections using proportional representation. So this is not a new thing. So when you are bringing something like proportional representation at the local government level, it must be part of a wider explanation of how you intend to phase this in to the system of government.
And not to just simply say because an election is coming up, let's jump up and pretend, for example, that we're going to make some kind of dynamic change.
Well, Mickela, you would remember.
When the people themselves didn't understand, isn't this about the people when it comes down to it? It's about the people. I have to tell you, the Ramada Commission, I don't know, having gone to the consultation, at least one myself, that anybody who was there may even understand that document.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's what they're trying to do, go back to the people to explain it. I just don't know, for my own information, how their proposals increase accountability. That's what I care about at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because if we are saying the problems that we have with our current constitution is that it does not hold the government of the day, whether it's the PP or the ILP or COP or PNM, to account, how do these suggestions and these recommendations hold the government of the day to account? And I'm not sure that they've explained it, or they themselves probably understand it. Yeah. But give people their opportunity. We haven't heard anything else about it, so I'm at a loss.
At the end of the day, Mickela, what you would find that proportional representation, and the acronym is very ironic, it was simply a PR exercise, where before the local government election, that was an exercise to tell people, I believe I may lose some, so I'm going to put some things in place because I may have the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It is very clear that even those who proposed it had no clue about how they were going to do it. And the formula.
That's frightening.
The formula, because it was done on 3 successive sittings where different members of the government tried to explain how this thing would work.
And each
you
said
come
something
up with,
different.
Every time you came up with something different. So you are asking the question, is it that they put you have to go back to the people? The worst thing you can do, I'm taking my perspective as a teacher.
Yes.
A confused teacher cannot teach properly.
Cannot get their point across.
Right. You cannot open the minds of individuals to anything that is new in the learning environment simply because you yourself are confused. What we had in the PR was clearly some hurried and hasty attempt to introduce the notion of proportional representation, not even clear about the procedure and the formula to be used. Now, proportional representation is one of the things that in my humble opinion, has to be included in any constitutional reform in this country.
And that's exactly what my next question was. I was going to ask you what your views are on PR, but we need to go to a break now. So please join us when we come back in a couple of minutes. Join us. We are with the political leader, forgive me, of the ILP. See you in a couple of minutes.